Hello, welcome to Know About History channel. Hope you like it.
The history of military medicine underwent a seismic and permanent transformation during the second global conflict of the 20th century, marking a period where the odds of survival for a wounded soldier were radically recalibrated through a combination of logistical brilliance, pharmaceutical breakthroughs, and a fundamental reimagining of the chain of evacuation. In previous conflicts, most notably the First World War, a serious wound to the abdomen or a compound fracture was frequently a delayed death sentence, not necessarily from the initial trauma but from the inevitable onset of sepsis, gas gangrene, or irreversible hemorrhagic shock. The Allied medical services in the 1940s, however, initiated a systematic overhaul of trauma care that effectively turned these survival rates upside down, ensuring that if a soldier reached an organized medical facility alive, their chances of recovery climbed to an unprecedented 97%. This achievement was not the result of a single, miracle discovery but rather the synchronization of an entire medical industrial complex that treated the wounded soldier as a high-priority logistical challenge, moving the hospital to the patient rather than waiting for the patient to reach the hospital. At the core of this revolution was the concept of the golden hour, the critical window of time following a traumatic injury during which medical intervention is most likely to prevent death. Allied planners realized that the primary killers on the battlefield were shock and infection. To combat shock, the introduction of blood plasma and whole blood at the front lines was perhaps the most significant tactical medical advancement of the war. Before the 1940s, transfusions were complex procedures requiring direct person-to-person links or highly unstable refrigerated whole blood. The work of Dr. Charles Drew and the development of dried plasma allowed for a stable, portable substance that could be reconstituted with distilled water in a muddy foxhole or a pitching landing craft. This meant that a combat medic, often under direct enemy fire, could begin the process of restoring a casualty's blood volume within minutes of the injury. By the time the soldier reached a forward surgical team, their circulatory system had been stabilized enough to survive the rigors of anesthesia and invasive surgery, a factor that single-handedly slashed the mortality rates from internal hemorrhaging. The role of the combat medic, or corpsman in the naval services, was redefined from a mere stretcher-bearer to a highly trained technician of the red zone. These individuals were the first link in the Allied medical chain, and their equipment reflected the new scientific approach to trauma. Every medic carried morphine syrettes for immediate pain relief, which not only eased the soldier's suffering but also played a psychological role in reducing the onset of neurogenic shock. They also carried sulfanilamide powder, a wonder drug of the early war years that was sprinkled directly into open wounds to inhibit bacterial growth. The sulfa era represented the first time in human history that the microscopic invaders of the battlefield were met with a chemical defense at the moment of entry. While sulfa was later overshadowed by penicillin, its widespread use in the early campaigns in North Africa and Italy prevented thousands of cases of the dreaded gas gangrene that had decimated armies in the previous generation. As the wounded moved back from the point of injury, they entered a sophisticated, tiered system of triage and treatment. The battalion aid station, located just hundreds of yards behind the front lines, served as the first point of stabilization. Here, medical officers performed life-saving procedures such as tracheotomies or the splinting of major fractures. The Allied use of the Thomas splint, particularly for femur fractures, was a carryover from the end of the previous war but was refined to an art form. By immobilizing the leg, the splint prevented the jagged ends of the bone from severing the femoral artery during transport, a common cause of death during the evacuation process. From the aid station, the patient was moved by jeep or ambulance to a clearing station and then to an evacuation hospital. This chain was designed for speed, and the Allied investment in motorization meant that even in the difficult terrain of the Italian Apennines or the hedgerows of Normandy, a casualty could be on an operating table within a few hours of falling. The true game changer in the pharmaceutical arsenal was penicillin. Discovered by Alexander Fleming but brought to mass production by the American pharmaceutical industry and the British team of Florey and Chain, penicillin arrived in significant quantities just in time for the D-Day landings in June 1944. Its impact was nothing short of miraculous. Unlike sulfa drugs, which merely inhibited bacteria, penicillin was actively bactericidal. It could treat systemic infections and deep-seated wound contamination that would have previously required amputation or resulted in death. The survival rates for chest and abdominal wounds, which had been abysmal in 1914 to 1918, plummeted as surgeons could now operate with the knowledge that post-operative infection could be managed. The Allied ability to produce penicillin on an industrial scale was a closely guarded secret and a strategic advantage that the Axis powers never managed to replicate, leaving German and Japanese soldiers to suffer from infections that were easily cured in Allied wards. Surgical intervention also saw a paradigm shift through the creation of the auxiliary surgical groups. These were mobile teams of highly specialized surgeons, often the best in their fields, who were not tied to a specific hospital but were moved to wherever the fighting was heaviest. They operated in tents or requisitioned buildings, often under artillery fire, bringing general hospital level care to within a few miles of the infantry. These teams pioneered techniques in vascular surgery, repairing damaged arteries that previously would have necessitated amputation. They also perfected the open wound technique for debridement, where surgeons would cut away dead and contaminated tissue but leave the wound open to be closed later in a sterile environment. This prevented the anaerobic bacteria that cause gangrene from being trapped inside a closed incision, a hard-learned lesson that saved tens of thousands of limbs. The logistical genius of the Allied medical effort was perhaps most visible in the development of air evacuation. The use of transport aircraft, such as the C-47 Skytrain, to move the wounded changed the geography of survival. A soldier wounded in the heart of France could be in a specialized hospital in England by evening. Flight nurses, a new and elite corps of medical professionals, managed the patients during these journeys, ensuring that the transition between theaters of war did not result in a lapse in care. This air bridge not only improved the physical outcomes for the wounded but also provided a massive boost to morale. Every soldier knew that if they were hit, the entire weight of the Allied logistical machine would be mobilized to get them home. In the Pacific Theater, where vast distances and tropical diseases presented unique challenges, air evacuation and the use of specialized, portable, surgical hospitals allowed the Allies to maintain a healthy fighting force in environments that had historically defeated whole armies through malaria and dysentery. The prevention of disease was as important as the treatment of wounds. The Allied Medical Corps waged a constant war against the mosquito and the louse. The development and widespread use of DDT and atabrine, as a substitute for quinine, allowed Allied troops to operate in the South Pacific and the Mediterranean with a significantly lower rate of non-battle casualties than their opponents. In the final years of the war, the Allies were also pioneers in the treatment of what was then called combat exhaustion, or shell shock. Recognizing that psychiatric casualties were an inevitable byproduct of modern warfare, they began to treat these men close to the front lines with rest, food, and counseling, returning many to their units and preventing the long-term institutionalization that had followed the First World War. The statistical reality of these efforts was staggering. In the First World War, the mortality rate for wounded soldiers who reached a hospital was approximately 8 to 10%. In the Second World War, that number dropped to between 3 and 4%. For specific types of injuries, the change was even more dramatic. The mortality rate for fractured femurs dropped from 50% in early World War I to less than 5% by the end of World War II. The Allied medical services had effectively decoupled the lethality of the weapon from the mortality of the wound. This was achieved through a philosophy that saw the medic as an integral part of the combat team and medical technology as a primary instrument of victory. The legacy of these Allied medics lives on in modern civilian trauma centers, the paramedic system, and the global blood bank infrastructure, all of which had their origins in the mud and the blood of the 1940s. The integration of nursing into the frontline medical effort was another pillar of the Allied success. The U.S. Army Nurse Corps and their British counterparts served in every theater, often working in horrific conditions to provide the post-operative care that was essential for recovery. Their presence brought a level of professional observation and patient management that complemented the work of the surgeons. Nurses were often the ones who first noticed the signs of a failing transfusion or the onset of a new infection, and their dedication to the long tail of recovery ensured that the initial success on the operating table was not lost in the days that followed. The role of women in the medical services during the war was a defining moment in the history of the profession, proving that female medical personnel were indispensable to the functioning of a modern military. As the war entered its final phases, the Allied medical machine reached a level of efficiency that was almost industrial. During the invasion of Okinawa, for example, the medical response involved hospital ships, massive air evacuation hubs, and a sophisticated system for managing thousands of casualties simultaneously. The scale of the effort was unprecedented, yet the individual soldier remained the focus. The use of the emergency medical tag, a simplified record of treatment that was tied to the casualty's clothing, ensured that as the soldier moved through the chain of evacuation, every doctor and nurse knew exactly what drugs had been administered and what procedures had been performed. This continuity of care was a hallmark of the Allied system and prevented the fatal errors that often occurred in the chaos of retreat or rapid advance. The technological and procedural leaps made by Allied medics did more than just win a war. They fundamentally altered the human expectation of what was possible in the face of catastrophe. By turning the survival rates upside down, they transformed the battlefield from a place of certain doom into a place where, despite the violence, there was a robust and scientific pathway back to life. The art of survival, in the 1940s, was a masterpiece of human ingenuity, a testament to the idea that even in the midst of the most destructive conflict in history, the impulse to heal and to protect could achieve heights that were just as remarkable as the weapons of war themselves. The silent victory of the Allied medics was measured in the millions of men who returned home to their families, men who in any previous century would have been left behind on the field of honor. The development of specialized dental and maxillofacial units also played a critical role in the rehabilitation of the wounded. Facial injuries, which were particularly common due to the nature of trench warfare in the early stages and the prevalence of shrapnel, were not only physically devastating but also psychologically scarring. Allied surgeons and dentists worked together to pioneer early plastic surgery and reconstructive techniques. They used new materials for prosthetics and developed methods for bone grafting that would become the foundation of modern reconstructive surgery. These efforts were aimed not just at saving lives, but at restoring the soldiers' humanity and their ability to reintegrate into civilian society after the war. This holistic approach to the whole patient marked the beginning of modern rehabilitative medicine. The Allied Medical Service also excelled in the management of environmental injuries, such as trench foot and immersion foot. During the brutal winter of 1944 in the Ardennes, thousands of soldiers were at risk of losing their feet due to the cold and wet conditions. The Medical Corps implemented aggressive education programs on foot hygiene, mandated the changing of socks, and developed specialized ointments and waterproof footwear. While the problem was never entirely eliminated, the medical intervention prevented a logistical collapse that could have crippled the Allied advance. This focus on preventive maintenance for the human body was a direct extension of the same logistical mindset that kept tanks and planes in the fight. The impact of the Allied medical revolution extended to the treatment of prisoners of war and displaced persons in the aftermath of the conflict. When the Allies liberated the concentration camps and POW camps in Germany and Japan, they were faced with a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions. The medical services were the first to enter these sites, deploying mobile laboratories to identify diseases and establishing emergency feeding programs to stabilize the starving. The lessons learned in treating combat exhaustion and tropical diseases were applied to the survivors of the Holocaust and the survivors of the brutal labor camps in the Pacific. The Allied medic became a symbol of liberation, a figure who brought not just freedom but the scientific means to sustain life in the wake of total devastation. The logistical miracle of Blood for Britain and subsequent blood collection programs in the United States demonstrated the power of home front mobilization for medical purposes. Millions of civilians donated blood, which was then processed into plasma and shipped across the oceans. This created a direct link between the civilian population and the survival of the soldier on the front line. It was a massive, voluntary undertaking that required a sophisticated infrastructure of refrigerated transport and sterile processing, much of which was developed on the fly. This program laid the groundwork for the modern Red Cross blood donation system, proving that the health of the military and the health of the nation were inextricably linked. The final analysis of Allied medical success must also include the incredible bravery of the individual medic. Carrying no weapons and marked only by a Red Cross that was not always respected by the enemy, these men and women walked into the jaws of death to pull others out. Their stories of valor, crawling through minefields, shielding patients with their own bodies, and performing surgeries by the light of a single flashlight, provided the moral core of the medical services. The survival rates upside down story is a story of statistics and science, but it is also a story of profound human courage. It is the story of how the Allies decided that no soldier was expendable and that no wound was too great to attempt a cure. The legacy of this era is found today in every ambulance that speeds toward a hospital and every trauma surgeon who works to stabilize a patient in the critical first hour. The principles of triage, the importance of rapid evacuation, the use of intravenous fluids, and the aggressive application of antibiotics are all gifts from the Allied medical teams of the Second World War. They turned the tide of history by proving that in the contest between the bullet and the bandage, when backed by the full power of a determined civilization, could ultimately prevail. The survival of the many was the greatest victory of all, and it was won one patient, one transfusion, and one golden hour at a time. The specific case of the Portable Surgical Hospital, PSH, in the Pacific serves as a perfect microcosm of this ingenuity. These were 25-man units that could be broken down and carried on the backs of the personnel themselves, allowing them to follow the infantry through the densest jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines. These units operated within a few thousand yards of the fighting, often performing major abdominal surgery under a canvas tarp while tropical rain poured down and the sound of machine guns echoed through the trees. The PSH was the ultimate expression of the "move the hospital to the patient" philosophy. In the Pacific, where the environment was often as lethal as the Japanese army, these units were the thin line between a survivable wound and a lonely death in the bush. The survival rates in these portable units were nearly as high as those in fixed hospitals back in the United States, a feat that remains one of the most impressive in the history of military medicine. Furthermore, the Allied approach to anesthesia underwent a revolution. The use of intravenous sodium pentothal replaced the more dangerous and cumbersome ether masks in many forward positions. This allowed for a quicker induction of anesthesia and a more controlled recovery, which was vital when multiple casualties were being processed in rapid succession. The development of portable anesthesia machines also allowed surgeons to work in environments that would have been impossible only a few years prior. These technical refinements, though less publicized than penicillin or plasma, were essential components of the overall system that kept the wounded alive. The medical intelligence units of the Allies also played a role that is often overlooked. They studied the health of enemy populations and the prevalence of diseases in upcoming theaters of operation. This allowed the medical corps to stockpile the correct vaccines and treatments long before the first troops landed. For example, before the invasion of North Africa, the Allies were prepared for the threat of typhus, and they deployed mass vaccination programs and dusting stations to prevent an outbreak that could have stalled the campaign. This preemptive medicine was a key part of the strategic planning of the war, ensuring that the Allied machine was never sidelined by a biological enemy. The transition from war to peace saw many of these medical officers return to civilian life, bringing their hard-won expertise with them. The rapid advancement of thoracic and cardiac surgery in the 1950s can be traced directly back to the experiences of surgeons who had operated on the hearts and lungs of soldiers in the 1940s. The GI Bill and other programs helped to train a new generation of doctors who were schooled in the fast-paced, high-pressure environment of the military medical chain. This infusion of talent and technique transformed the civilian medical landscape, leading to a golden age of medical discovery that continued for decades. The upside-down survival rates of the war became the new standard for the world. The deep historical memory of the Allied medic remains a source of inspiration. It is a reminder that even in the darkest hours of human history, the pursuit of healing can achieve a level of brilliance that matches any act of destruction. The Allied medics did more than just save lives. They preserved the future by ensuring that a generation of young men could return to build a new world. Their success was a triumph of organization, a victory for science, and a monument to the enduring value of the individual. As long as there is conflict, the lessons of the 1940s will remain the blueprint for how to protect and preserve life in the face of the unthinkable. The story of the Allied medics is the story of how we learned to fight for every heartbeat, and in doing so, we changed the world forever. The development of the Lister bag for water purification, the implementation of V-mail for rapid communication of medical records, and the use of the Jeep as a versatile ambulance are all further examples of how the Allies looked at the medical problem from a 360-degree perspective. No detail was too small, from the design of a better stretcher to the formulation of a more effective insect repellent. The Allied Medical Corps was a learning organization, constantly adapting to new threats and incorporating new data from the field. This iterative process of improvement was what allowed them to continually push the boundaries of what was possible, turning the survival statistics in their favor with every passing month of the war. The final testament to their success is not found in the history books, but in the lives of the millions of veterans who grew old and saw their children and grandchildren grow up because a medic was there with a syringe of morphine, a bottle of plasma, and the skill to use them. The Allied medics didn't just turn survival rates upside down. They gave the world a lesson in what it means to truly value human life in the midst of its most brutal devaluation. Their legacy is the very foundation of modern emergency medicine, a silent but powerful force that continues to save lives in every corner of the globe today. The golden hour they discovered and the chain of evacuation they perfected remain the gold standard for trauma care, a permanent gift to humanity from the most devastating war in history. The logistical coordination of the hospital ships, such as the USS Comfort and the HMHS Newfoundland, provided a floating sanctuary for the wounded, equipped with the latest technology and staffed by elite medical teams. These ships were painted brilliant white with large red crosses, and while they were sometimes targeted by enemy fire, they generally served as a mobile safety valve for the medical chain, allowing for the rapid evacuation of thousands of casualties from beachheads like those at Anzio and Iwo Jima. The presence of these ships just offshore was a visible sign of the Allied commitment to medical care, providing a psychological anchor for the troops fighting on the shore. These floating hospitals were precursors to the modern hospital ships that still serve in humanitarian and military roles today, continuing the tradition of bringing advanced medical care to the world's most difficult environments. The training of the medics themselves was an intense and accelerated process that turned civilians, teachers, farmers, clerks, into life-saving specialists in a matter of months. They were taught not just the basics of first aid, but the complexities of triage, the administration of advanced drugs, and the psychological management of trauma. This democratization of medical knowledge was a radical departure from the elitism that had sometimes characterized the medical profession in the past. It proved that given the right training and equipment, the average citizen could perform miracles on the battlefield. This spirit of empowerment and practical skill remains a core value of the modern paramedic and emergency medical technician professions, which were born from the necessity of the Second World War. In conclusion, the Allied medical effort of 1939 to 1945 was a masterpiece of human organization and compassion. It was a period where the scientific method was applied to the most chaotic of human endeavors, war, and the results were a dramatic increase in the value of the human life. The survival rates upside down story is one of the few truly positive narratives to emerge from that dark period, a story of hope and healing in a time of death and destruction. It is a story that should be remembered not just as a part of military history, but as a central chapter in the history of human progress. The Allied medics were the architects of a new era of medicine, an era where the injury was no longer the end of the story, but the beginning of a journey back to health, thanks to the most sophisticated and successful medical system ever devised. Their work remains a standard of excellence that continues to guide the healers of today, reminding us all that even in the face of the greatest evil, our capacity to care for one another is our most powerful and enduring strength. The synergy between the military and the academic medical community also accelerated during this time. Universities and research hospitals worked hand in hand with the War Department to solve specific problems, such as the treatment of high-altitude frostbite for bomber crews or the prevention of tropical fungal infections. This public-private partnership created a massive innovation engine that pushed the boundaries of medical science at a pace that would have been impossible in peacetime. The discovery of the Rh factor in blood and the development of the first effective influenza vaccines were direct results of this wartime collaboration. The Allied medical effort was truly a total war on disease and death, a mobilization of every resource available to the modern state. As the war came to an end, the Allied medical services had not only saved an army but had redefined the relationship between the soldier and the state. The promise of medical care, from the foxhole to the home, was a social contract that set the stage for the creation of national health systems and the expansion of veteran benefits in the post-war world. The value placed on the life of the individual soldier during the war translated into a new social value for health and well-being in the decades that followed. The medics who turned survival rates upside down in the 1940s were, in a very real sense, the fathers and mothers of the modern health-conscious society. Their legacy is the world we live in today, a world where we expect, and often receive, the same high level of care that was once only available to those who fought on the front lines of the greatest war in history. The story of the Allied medics is a story of how a generation of healers changed the course of the world, one life at a time.